My name's Steve Ardagh, CEO and founder of Eagle Protect. We're a disposable glove company and PPE supplier, and we sell to companies that care about what they do in their food safety. I'll introduce Darin shortly. I'm going to give you a quick rundown on some very exciting research we've been involved in over the last 5 years and has now finally just been accepted for publication after peer review in the Journal of Food Protection magazine. The article has exposed a bit of a dirty underbelly in the PPE, particularly the glove industry, of things like microbial, chemical and physical contamination. Darin's going to talk about the cost of doing nothing, which is one of his great expressions, profit versus safety, and then I'll talk about the incorporating gloves more seriously in HACCP and in FSMA planning. So this is the title of the paper, and as usual with microbiologists, etc., they make it nice and succinct, but it's really about the potential for glove risk amplification via the various factors I talked about. Just a few little quotes out of the paper. First on microbial contamination. These are some of the things that were found on gloves entering the US, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail, from unused disposable gloves entering the US from Southeast Asia. How did that happen? We did a test over 2,800 gloves over 5 years, and the reason we did this testing is we realised early on that there wasn't a lot of protection for our customers in terms of food safety. So we decided to set up our own test process, and this was part of the calibration process. We did 2,800 new and unused gloves, 26 brands of FDA compliant medical and food gloves. We found at least 260 unique and viable pathogens on the gloves entering the country, and just to top it off, over 50% of the samples had indicators of human fecal matter. Glove contamination is invisible, but the consequences are not. Onto the chemical side, one of the other factors is that FDA food compliance doesn't require gloves to be clean or intact. It's just a chemical migration and chemical content test. But gloves aren't checked on arrival into the US by anybody generally. Occasionally they'll stop a container, but not usually, especially not for food grade gloves. So even though the gloves are supposed to be free of dangerous chemicals, nobody's checking, and often they're not. And we've found all sorts of different chemicals in gloves that shouldn't be there, including in a case study that we did with Freer Farms, which is a cannabis producer in Washington, where they found a carcinogen which they tracked back to their gloves. Now, the sad part about that story is the glove they used, and I won't mention the brand at all, is used in probably about 20 or 30% of the food industry in the States. And the wearers of those gloves are not aware that they're wearing a glove that could contain a carcinogen. So again, it's just the gloves are imported without the benefit of inspection, to use that FDA term, and we're really relying on the honour system with the factories in Southeast Asia, and we know from experiences such as this that it's not always going to be that way, unfortunately. And lastly, the physical contamination, and this is the one that's probably most obvious for people, where gloves are ripping, and a piece of glove will get in your hamburger or your mince, ground beef, that sort of thing. But the other part of it is that before that glove has failed, it's been building up a beautiful slurry of glove juice that contains all the pathogens we talked about and some of the chemicals. So by the time it rips, you get this big spray of glove juice that contain all sorts of things over the food product. And I remember going into a butcher somewhere, again, I won't name the brand, but the butcher was wearing 3 pairs of gloves. And I said, why are you doing that? And he said, because they rip all the time. And he was cutting up steak and trimming fat off it. And I said to him, but the last glove, you're going to spray and pre-salt the steak. And he didn't sort of get the message. But they're now using our fine, tough gloves, I'm happy to say. So crisis averted. I guess, so the glove pieces also contribute to the microbial and chemical contamination of the glove. So it really makes a beautiful scenario of how dangerous a bad glove can be. And how does it happen? I mean, there's toxic raw materials. Factories are required by the FDA to send one sample, basically to get FDA food compliance. And from there on, many of the factories are looking at ways of making gloves cheaper. And a simple way is to add 20% of chalk to the mix, but other ways are to use less reliable raw materials, which can be toxic. Dirty factories, I've been to many factories across Southeast Asia, and I can tell you some of them are pristine and others are the opposite. Most of the contamination comes from the local water source, so the gloves are washed as part of the process to leach out chemicals and theoretically clean the gloves, but it's often the contamination from the dirty water source and poor filtration. Substandard leach and wash tanks, packing cross-contamination, so packing rooms, and I've got a lovely story. The very first glove factory I went to, the packing room was an open, walled, just with a roof on it, shed, and there were round tables with about 10 ladies packing gloves by hand into boxes. And one guy's job was to walk around these piles of gloves and wipe off the cockroaches and flies before they put the gloves into the boxes. And this was well before we entered the US, but they were medical grade gloves destined for US hospitals. The other part, and it was certainly raised during the pandemic, is the fraudulent supply chain. There was a lot of counterfeit gloves. And another really great story, you can see why I only get invited to parties once, because I tell these stories and then never get seen again. But one of the stories, during the pandemic, gloves were being shipped down from Chinese hospitals, used gloves from Chinese hospitals down to Thailand, then repackaged into counterfeit boxes and sent back to the US. And we've witnessed many of these. In fact, one of our customers asked us what this was on a glove. There was a streak of red across the glove, and I said, well, that's blood from a Chinese hospital. And he was handling meat products. But fortunately, those sort of things, the FDA has clamped down on that a little bit more. And now that the pandemic is sort of over for now, the supply of gloves is back to some sort of normality. So the lax regulations, and we're not having to go at the FDA by any means here. The FDA food compliance is really, the intent is really clear. It's around chemical content and migration. So are the gloves safe to handle food, and is anything going to move from the glove onto the food product? And that's what the test. So it's a one-off test with no expiration date. It's a chemical migration test only. It's not tested, so gloves are not tested for bioburden, cleanliness, or physical characteristics like holes. And there's no AQL for food compliant gloves. AQL, acceptable quality level, is a measure, a number of tests taken to measure for holes in medical gloves, medical grade gloves. So I guess that's a very quick rundown of the paper and what we've discovered, and that's all the bad news. And I'll get Darin to come and sort of talk more about some of the solutions that we can put in place to make hands, as we call them, the foundation of food safety, so the gloves are actually safe.
Thank you. You know, every time I come to an event like this, it's like being surrounded by heroes. Years back, I had an opportunity to meet with a child who, the family meeting there, they were talking about how he was sick with E. coli, and he recovered, but he had a stroke while on dialysis, and he was unable to use one of his arms. He drew a crayon drawing of a superhero in flight, cape, tights, and said that he wished that someone had said something or done something that could have prevented him from not being able to play like other kids in the playground. And, you know, we don't think about superheroes without thinking about, like, Batman and his tools. And you know, he wears gloves too, right? We want to make sure that we're asking people to be heroes in terms of food safety, that they have the proper equipment, the proper gear to do this. And almost consistently, when I'm in conversations with folks in food safety quality assurance, I hear that one of the biggest objectives that are obstacles they have to overcome is that even though they want to make the right decision, they want to purchase the right equipment, they want to do the right testing, inspections, all that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's those people who have the purchasing power in the finance department that are their biggest obstacle. But we need to understand that foundation of food safety that the right glove can provide for us. The idea of ripped gloves causing contamination, of quality control, foreign material and toxins is becoming a much more prevalent issue. Also, the idea of non-compliance due to ripped gloves and decrease in return on investment. The idea of cheaper gloves actually, or the wrong gloves, actually having a negative impact on your return on investment. So when folks in financing talk about the cost of doing things, I try to emphasize the fact that what if we flip the conversation and start talking about the cost of doing nothing? For instance, we know that 58% of companies surveyed haven't been impacted by food recalls, and 6% of those had 11 to 20 recalls. In fact, between 2021 and 2022, food recalls spiked by 700%, including foreign material contamination. And if you look at some of those recent information put out by AFTO and some other organizations, you'll start to see that in some areas, there are more recalls caused by foreign material in finished product than there are recalls because of E. coli of all things. So we have to look at that and the fact that we're looking at the idea of $10 million as an average direct company costs of some of these food recalls. And $100 million direct and indirect costs to some 5% of companies that are dealing with recalls. So we have to look at this in terms of the cost of doing nothing if we're not using the right gloves, if we're not investing properly into gloves. What can we be dealing with? If we take it further, and I'm glad to see Chuck Jolly here because very recently, only a few weeks ago, in Food Safety News, I published an op-ed, and it included this graph. I didn't make up these numbers. This is basically the idea of when you start looking at the federal fines for failures in food safety, you'll start to notice a trend here. I remember when ConAgra was the largest. I remember when Chipotle was the largest fine, $25 million. And right after that, 19.35 collectively was the fine for Bluebell. And then just recently, only a few weeks ago, we looked at the idea of Family Dollar stores, $41 million fine. This has nothing to do with the revenues lost because consumers can decide to go somewhere else. So it's not only the cost of doing nothing that is increasing, it's also the costs associated with the idea of the penalties for actively failing, if you will, in terms of leadership when it comes to food safety and quality assurance. Take a look at this. Just Google or search within Food Safety News to see the rest of the article that went with this. And basically my point that I bring out in the article is that it's not if, it's when will this number be eclipsed by some other large fine. But we can also look at time in a different sense. Now, I know this might look complicated, but I'll walk you through it. If you look at the red dotted curve, it used to be that companies didn't make significant changes in terms of their protocols and their equipment until there was legislative or litigation changes. Essentially, enough court cases were prompting them to do something different. And over time, we see an increase in liabilities. We also see that our options decrease in terms of trying to mitigate a problem. Now, I know that the green line here shows what I have observed over the last 3 decades is that social media awareness, consumers being seen as stakeholders and considered as stakeholders, has prompted many companies to act earlier. When they do that, they decrease the liabilities, and they can also increase the options to resolve these issues. But imagine if we start acting proactive. We don't have to wait for some magical silver bullet and some kind of digital solution out there. And once we have that in 5 to 10 years, everything's going to be better. We have a solution right now in terms of the idea of better gloves and trying to prevent the cross-contamination, to prevent these issues, to prevent the recalls. And the idea here that if we can insert this as an active activity for control, perhaps we can not only maximize our options, maximize the value of these options, but imagine doing this before there's an incident when we even have, at this point, we have zero liabilities. So we don't have to wait for some technological silver bullet out there when there are real solutions right now that literally we can immediately put these solutions in our hands and think about the return on investment because of preventing that recall, preventing that failure, preventing those liabilities. And if you want to look at it in terms of a very specific type of economic view, preventing those huge growing federal fines in terms of failure to do the right thing. So this is just one way of looking at the idea of if you look at gloves in terms of the benefits, but also the return on investment for this, it's a different way of looking at it. And I'm really excited to be able to say that, again, we don't have to wait for some theoretical magic bullet out there. There are solutions, and these are some of them right now. But I want to bring Steve back to talk about specifically looking at science-based and purchasing elements with gloves. So let's bring Steve back.
Thank you.
Hold on a second. It's okay to applause. Go ahead.
I'll bring Darin back for the last slide where he can add some of his humour and skills to that. I hate following people like Darin. It's not good for your ego. But anyway, back to gloves. I guess the point we're trying to make is we're a food safety company. We're not a glove company. We're a food safety company that sells gloves. And so our focus is on helping the industry as simply as possible be better. And one of the great things about, and to Darin's point, one of the great things about gloves is you don't have to train someone to use a new glove. They know how to put it on. So you get rid of the old stuff, get some of the good stuff in, and we're trying to raise the bar for the whole industry. And a lot of our work is public knowledge, open source, and we've got our test process, which I'll go through in a minute, and we're happy to help the industry improve the whole food safety sector and medical eventually as well. But the return on gloves is pretty significant. We talk about cost per month or lifetime cost of a glove rather than cost per glove, because a cheap glove is often much more expensive, even without recalls and everything else, per month. We know that we base on a lot of research we've done over the years, we believe about 20 to 25% of gloves that enter the US never get used. They rip before use, and so they end up straight in waste. So straight away, and there's 328 million gloves used every day in the US. So we could save 40 or 50 million gloves every day from going into waste just by using a better glove. So those return on investment for the community and the country is huge in terms of that. We know workers, some of the workers, that when we swap them to our gloves, they love them. In fact, we just were talking to a lady who said our team love the gloves. They feel so good, and that's slightly weird, but the gloves are really comfortable. Good gloves are less sweaty, all these sort of things that help productivity and worker and consumer health as well. The supply chain, the glove industry is pretty similar to the rag industry in terms of bad labour rights violations, child labour, forced labour. In fact, the Border Patrol in the US banned 6 factories from sending gloves to the US during the pandemic, which was a pretty gutsy move when there was such a high demand for gloves based on labour rights violations. And these are the largest companies in the world that supply gloves, not the small ones necessarily. So that's a big part of, we're a certified B Corp, and we have a very stringent ethical supply chain that we have independently, what's the word I'm looking for, certificated by SEDEX and various others. Costco, one of our really good customers, also send their inspectors and auditors down to the factories to check as well. So we're pretty confident that our gloves are as good as any in the country in terms of the supply chain. Traceability is another big one, obviously, with the FDA moves in recent times, and our gloves have this QR code on here that you can trace every box of gloves back to the factory and everything it's done in between times. So you know when it's been manufactured, what transport it's had, when it arrived in the country. You can also get all the test results that we do just on your phone and find out everything you need to find out about that particular glove, that particular box of gloves. Our Delta Zero testing I'll go through in a minute, and one of the other big focuses is how do we incorporate more of this into a HACCP, in other words, sourcing gloves, but asking for much more quantitative sort of information on the gloves as they come into your facility. The Delta Zero testing, I don't pretend to be a microbiologist and I can't say half of these words, but we developed this test process, 5-layered lot test process over the last 5 or 6 years with the Barry Michaels group. And it's pretty comprehensive: GCMS, gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, and that gives us a fingerprint of the glove so we know that every glove is the same as the previous lot. We do the microbial counts and 16S genome sequencing. Structural integrity, the normal tests you would do for holes and tears and quality. And then the dermal compatibility is something that we actually picked up from an IVF doctor professor in Germany who discovered that the nitrile gloves she was using with some of her sperm samples was affecting the motility of the sperm. And they weren't even touching, there was no contact. And so we've discovered that some of the raw materials in gloves can be pretty damaging to the skin. And I guess people who have had sort of various eczema or rashes or allergies will make testament to that. So we do a lot of testing on the dermal compatibility of the gloves as well. And lastly, with the HACCP plan, and I'll ask Darin to come up and comment on this as well, but as it says in the article here, gloves are often just treated as simple consumable commodities, and particularly by food, no offence to the procurement people, but particularly by the procurement, they just see a product on their spreadsheet that they have to buy. And we're saying that there should be much more focus on this in terms of making sure that you're getting a safe product. The article points out that on average, the testing showed that there's somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million colony forming units per box of 100 gloves coming into a plant based on the testing. So, I mean, that's an incredible infection rate to me when you're actually trying to keep these things out and you're actually purchasing them and bringing them into your plant potentially. But thank you very much for your patience. I tried to make sure we have a bit of time for question and answers, and I'll just get Darin to finish off for us.
I kind of spoiled the ending by saying already what I wanted to say, and that, again, we want to make sure that if we're expecting people to be courageous and act heroically, even though we might not call it out as being heroic, but when we look at the idea of the food safety practices that we want our workforce to have are what consumers think are absolutely necessary. And with anyone who's been impacted by food safety knows that anyone who could prevent you from going through that kind of a scenario would be a hero in your life. And the last thing we want to do is ask people to do that not being well equipped. I think as we get farther and farther away from our food sources, and there's questions that are asked in terms of, is that where chicken comes from? Is that where French fries come from? And the documentary Poisoned, a lot of people were very like, wait, is that how chickens, is that what we do in terms of chicken, kind of a thing? I think that it's also important to realize that there are companies that I talk with and restaurants and even retailers that they say one of the things that they struggle with new employees is that they have to teach them to wash their hands, and they have to teach them, and they never had to do that 20 years ago kind of a thing, and they have to teach them how to wear their gloves. Don't teach someone how to wear gloves unless you teach them why. And I'm really glad that one of the reasons why I'm working with Steve and with Eagle Protect is because this is a company with gloves that I see underscores and exemplifies exactly the why behind gloves that we need in food handling. I do want to point out that not only are we going to ask some questions here, but as you see in the large paper on your seat, we're going to do an Ask Me Anything back at booth number 328. I memorized that. Which is right down here in the 300 aisle. I'm happy to answer any and all of your questions. Anyway, thank you very much. We're going to answer some questions here. Great. Do we have time? Do we have time? We have time. We have 6 minutes for questions. At no cost. Free opportunity to ask questions. Yes. She's from California. So the question in California, looking at the idea of reducing that kind of one-time use plastic and look at recycling and things of that nature, I'm going to head over to Steve, but here's one thing to think about. If you're using gloves that will rip all the time, then you're using more gloves, right? If you're using gloves that are more flexible and agile and able to support the worker in terms of the work that they're doing, imagine being able to use less gloves. And that's just one point, but I think Steve might have some more.
It's a really good question, and we worry about it a lot because there's a lot of biodegradable gloves coming onto the market, and our research has shown that that's not actually a great option just yet, because there's some question about do they leave microplastics around and all these sort of things, because they're biodegradable because something's been added to them, not because they're inherently biodegradable. So our focus has always been like zero waste, so reduce first. The first is don't use them, but you need to use them, so then reduce. And a really good example, we supply one of the largest grocery stores in the country. We spent months with them on 8 locations doing testing with their old gloves versus the new gloves that we offered them. They were losing, we said you're probably losing 10 to 15% of gloves through ripping. They were losing 25%. So we moved them from a 4.8 gram vinyl glove to a 2.6 gram nitrile glove. So straight away you're halving the raw material in the glove itself. The gloves lasted longer, ripped less, and so they're saving, we calculate, around 1 million pounds of waste every year. So that's a big step. So there's no sort of silver bullet yet in terms of can we biodegrade, compost or whatever, but I think there's ways of doing that. And the other great thing to our previous point is you don't need to train people to do anything different, because you just put in a glove on, it just happens to be a better glove, and to use it properly, the process. So you've got good process in place to make sure you're not overusing gloves as well. Right. Yeah. It's just it's a necessary evil, for want of a better term. Sushi's interesting though, because nitrile gloves often don't work very well with sushi because the rice is too sticky. So you can try other options. There's TPE, which is a relatively new material. PE, they have other issues, but I mean, so there's a few. It's also getting the right choice, horses for courses type of thing, if you use that expression. So yeah, but the waste is a big one for us. But the other big thing with the biodegradable claims and compostable claims is nobody checks gloves on arrival into the US. So how do you know that it actually is what they say it is? And that's, to us, that's a way of saving. A factory could save money by not adding the additive, but no one's ever going to know unless you actually analysed it. So, anything else? We're pretty well out of time, but happy for you to come and talk to us at the booth at any time, or contact us through the information on those handouts as well. Thank you very much.